Catherine Whitmore stood before the floor-to-ceiling glass wall of the primary command center, her fingers pressing into the edge of the console until her knuckles turned white. It was past 2 in the morning, and the digital pulse of Etherion Dynamics was flatlining. Across the massive display walls, the green veins, representing a $40 billion automated logistics infrastructure, were bleeding into a violent, cascading red. Over 60,000 freight trucks carrying essential cargo across 47 states were pulling over to the shoulders of dark highways, completely blind. The proprietary artificial intelligence network that coordinated the entire empire had been paralyzed by a surgical, ruthless cyber attack. Standing just 3 feet behind her was Connor Reeves, the chief operating officer, his tailored suit perfectly unwrinkled despite the late hour. He poured a fresh cup of coffee, the soft clink of the porcelain sounding heavy in the tense room. Catherine could feel his gaze on the back of her neck. He did not need to speak to voice his judgment. For 6 months, ever since she became the youngest chief executive in the history of the corporation, Connor had quietly seeded doubts among the board members, waiting for the exact moment her leadership would crack. Tonight, the board had already sent 3 separate urgent notifications, subtly implying that perhaps it was time for an experienced hand like Connor to assume full operational control. The lead security engineer turned from his terminal, his face pale. He looked at Catherine, his voice trembling over the room's speakers as he confessed that his entire team was completely helpless. They had never seen an attack this advanced. It bypassed every firewall, as if the intruder possessed the exact blueprints of the core architecture. Every single hour the network remained dark cost the company over $1 million in penalties, but the financial ruin was nothing compared to the imminent loss of her life's work. Then, at precisely 2:13 in the morning, a soft chime echoed from Catherine's private terminal. A completely anonymous email had appeared in her inbox. The subject line was entirely blank, and the sender's address was an untraceable string of characters. Inside was a single sentence: check node 47 before sunrise. Attached to the message was a file containing 47 lines of remarkably elegant code. Desperate and running out of time, Catherine bypassed standard protocols and ordered her engineering team to deploy it immediately. Within 11 minutes, the cascading red alerts began to stall. By 4 in the morning, the servers breathed back to life, and the nationwide fleet of trucks began moving again. The anonymous savior had rescued a $40 billion empire and vanished without leaving a single trace. While the executive command center on the 32nd floor had been consumed by absolute panic, the 11th floor service corridor had been entirely quiet. Hunter Blake moved his heavy yellow maintenance cart slowly down the polished concrete hallway, his worn sneakers making almost no sound. At 29 years old, Hunter possessed a quiet, grounded masculinity that made him entirely invisible to the corporate ladder climbers, sprinting past him with laptops tucked under their arms. To the executives, he was simply a part of the background, a silent shadow in a gray uniform whose only purpose was to clean up their messes. As he pushed his cart past the server access wing, a sharp-voiced junior engineer named Derek brushed past, nearly knocking over Hunter's broom. Derek didn't offer an apology. Instead, he stopped and pointed a defensive finger at the floor. "Can you mop faster through here, janitor? We have a national crisis upstairs, and I don't need your equipment blocking the walkway. Get this area cleared right now." Hunter didn't flinch. He didn't alter the steady, calm rhythm of his movements. He simply nodded, his deep voice remarkably steady. "I'll clear the lane immediately, sir." Derek scoffed and hurried away, completely unaware that the quiet man he had just minimized was the only reason his terminal upstairs hadn't completely locked him out. Hunter watched the engineer disappear into the elevator, then turned his gaze toward a wall-mounted system status panel nearby. To anyone else, the flashing amber lights were just random glitches. To Hunter, they were a familiar melody. He read the failure patterns in real time, his sharp eyes identifying the exact origin of the breach within seconds. He reached into his pocket, his hand brushing against a small plastic toy unicorn his 7-year-old daughter had asked him to keep safe for her. A soft, protective warmth filled his chest, grounding him against the sterile coldness of the corporate tower. At 4:15 in the morning, his shift officially ended. Hunter walked out of the service entrance into the biting Chicago air. He crossed the concrete grid to the old parking garage, started his 12-year-old sedan with a familiar sputter, and drove toward his small apartment on the northwest side of the city. When he unlocked the door, the apartment was completely still. His daughter, Hannah, was curled up on the fabric sofa, wrapped tightly in a faded patchwork blanket that had once belonged to her mother. A colorful picture book lay open beside her small hand. As the lock clicked, Hannah blinked her heavy eyes open, looking up at her father with a soft, sleepy smile. "Did you have to fix something big tonight, Daddy?" Hunter set his worn jacket on the hook, walking over to the sofa with gentle steps. He knelt down, lifting her small frame into his arms with effortless care. "Just cleaning up a big mess, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice softening completely as he held her close. "Just making sure the roads are safe." Hannah rested her head against his shoulder, her voice drifting back into sleep. "You always clean up the biggest messes." Hunter carried her to her small bed, tucking the blanket around her shoulders before sitting in the quiet darkness of the hallway. Outside, the Chicago skyline was beginning to catch the first pale light of dawn. Thousands of trucks were moving safely across the country because of the code he had casually executed, yet tomorrow he would return to the building to scrub the very floors those executives walked on. He closed his eyes, the memory of his past life lingering like a shadow. Back in the high-tech command center, Catherine Whitmore was tracking the origin of the miracle email, her eyes widening as the security system finally flagged a location. The anonymous message had not been sent from an outside hacker terminal. It had been broadcast directly from an internal terminal on the 11th floor, sent by someone who was physically standing inside her own building while the crisis unfolded. She stared at the security log in absolute shock, realizing the genius she was hunting was closer than she ever could have imagined. By 9 o'clock the following morning, the atmosphere inside the executive suites of Etherion Dynamics had completely transformed. The morning financial wires were already calling the recovery a financial miracle, and the company's stock had opened up a massive 9%. Catherine sat behind her desk, watching the media coverage on her wall monitors with a hollow feeling in her chest. The board members who had been ready to fire her a few hours ago were now flooding her assistant with congratulatory calls. A sharp knock sounded at her door, and Connor Reeves stepped into her office. He carried a slim leather folder, a calculated, smooth smile fixed on his face. "An extraordinary turnaround, Catherine," Connor said, his tone dripping with practiced warmth. "The board is thrilled. You managed to pull a rabbit out of a hat at the absolute last second." Catherine looked up, keeping her expression perfectly guarded, the cold professionalism that had made her a feared negotiator snapping instantly into place. "The company survived, Connor. That is all that matters." "Of course," Connor replied, leaning slightly against the edge of her mahogany desk, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of vulnerability. "Though the IT security team tells me they cannot trace the exact origin of the patch script. A bit unusual for an internal fix, don't you think? If there is a rogue engineer operating outside the standard chain of command, we should identify them immediately. For security reasons, naturally. The situation is being handled internally," Catherine said coldly, her voice leaving zero room for further discussion. "I don't need you managing my engineering staff, Connor. Focus on the freight backlogs in the southern sector." Connor's smile didn't fade, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He nodded once and left the office, closing the heavy glass door silently behind him. The moment he was gone, Catherine let out a slow, sharp breath. She knew exactly what Connor was doing. He was fishing for information, trying to see if she actually knew who had saved her. And the truth was, she didn't. She knew only one thing. The transmission had come from the 11th floor service corridor. While Catherine was navigating the shark-infested waters of the executive suite, Hunter Blake was sitting in his idling sedan in the drop-off lane of Oak Ridge Elementary School. The morning sun hit the pristine rows of luxury SUVs and German sports cars driven by the wealthy parents of the historic district. Hunter sat in his rusted vehicle, still wearing his gray maintenance uniform with the faded Etherion Dynamics logo stitched over his chest. He could feel the eyes of the other parents on him, the subtle, calculated distance they maintained as they ushered their children past his car. Hannah sat in the passenger seat, her small backpack resting on her knees. She wasn't looking at the expensive cars or the pristine clothes of her classmates. She was looking at her father's hands, which were rough and calloused from years of heavy labor. "Daddy," Hannah said softly, her brown eyes remarkably clear. "The kids at the lunch table yesterday said that people who clean floors aren't smart enough to do anything else. They think poor means stupid." Hunter turned to his daughter, his expression softening instantly into a warm, grounded calm. He didn't offer a defensive anger or a comfortable lie. He reached out, his large hand gently cupping her shoulder, providing an immediate sense of absolute safety. "Hannah, what people think about your uniform doesn't change what's inside your mind. True strength isn't about the room you sit in. It's about what you do to keep the world moving when no one else knows how. Do you understand me? Hannah looked at him for a long moment, the anxiety draining from her small face as she nodded. She leaned over, giving him a tight hug before opening the car door. I know you're the smartest, Daddy, she whispered, then ran toward the school entrance. Hunter watched her until she safely crossed the threshold, his calm demeanor returning like armor as he shifted the car into drive. He didn't care about the judgment of the wealthy elites. His entire universe walked inside those school doors every morning, and protecting her was the only mandate that mattered. Later that afternoon, Catherine bypassed her entire IT department and requested the raw, unedited security footage from the 11th floor service corridor during the exact window of the cyber attack. She locked her office door and began reviewing the footage frame by frame. For nearly 2 hours, she saw nothing but empty hallways and standard data racks. Then, at exactly 2:07 in the morning, a figure appeared on the screen. It was a tall man in a maintenance uniform, pushing a yellow cleaning cart. He moved with a steady, unhurried posture that stood out drastically from the frantic panic that had consumed the rest of the building that night. As he reached the entrance of the primary server room, the man paused. Catherine leaned closer to the monitor, her heart racing. The man didn't open the secured door. He didn't even reach for a keycard. He simply stood completely still for exactly 4 seconds, his eyes fixed on the external diagnostic panel outside the server room. His body language wasn't that of a thief or an intruder. It was the posture of an expert reading a familiar map. After 4 seconds, he calmly continued down the hallway, disappearing out of frame. Just 6 minutes later, the miracle email had arrived in her inbox. Catherine stared at the frozen image of the unknown maintenance worker, a deep, unsettling suspicion taking root in her mind. The savior of her $40 billion empire wasn't an elite Silicon Valley consultant or a hidden government specialist. He was someone who wore a name tag she had never bothered to read. The high-pressure environment of Ethereum Dynamics allowed no room for personal disruptions, a rule Catherine Whitmore enforced more strictly upon herself than anyone else. Yet, by Thursday afternoon, a sudden emergency with her nanny forced her to bring her 6-year-old daughter, Sophia Whitmore, to the executive suite. Sophia was a quiet child, prone to severe sensory overload, and the cold, glass and steel expanse of the 32nd floor immediately made her uneasy. Catherine sat at her desk, attempting to review global shipping manifests while Sophia sat on the sleek leather sofa, clutching a stuffed animal tightly against her chest. The calm didn't last. A sudden, jarring fire drill test, unannounced by the building management, caused the overhead strobe lights to flash violently as a piercing siren echoed through the executive wings. The sudden wall of sound shattered Sophia's fragile composure. She gasped, her chest tightening instantly as a full-blown panic attack took hold. She scrambled off the sofa, collapsing onto the polished floor near the glass partition, hyperventilating violently as tears streamed down her face. Catherine dropped her pen, her heart leaping into her throat. The cold, ruthless CEO who could dismantle billionaire competitors in a boardroom vanished in a fraction of a second. She rushed to her daughter's side, her hands trembling uncontrollably as she pulled Sophia into her lap. Sophia, look at me. It's okay. It's just a test. Catherine pleaded, her voice cracking with an unfamiliar, terrifying helplessness. She tried to hold the child tight, but her own escalating panic only fed into Sophia's terror. The room seemed to close in on them. Several executive assistants and senior managers gathered at the glass doors, hovering uselessly, their faces filled with awkward discomfort. Connor Reeves stood at the back of the crowd, his arms crossed, watching Catherine's rare display of absolute vulnerability with a detached, calculating gaze. Money, power, and a $40 billion valuation could not buy the oxygen her daughter desperately needed to calm her lungs. Through the crowd of freezing employees, a tall figure stepped forward without hesitation. Hunter Blake set his maintenance cloth aside and moved into the executive office, his presence immediately shifting the energy in the room. While everyone else stood paralyzed by the CEO's breakdown, Hunter knelt directly onto the hard floor next to Catherine and the sobbing child. He didn't look at Catherine. He focused entirely on Sophia, his deep, steady voice cutting through the ringing sirens with an absolute, unshakable warmth. "Hey there, little trooper," Hunter said softly, his tone carrying a quiet masculinity that acted like an anchor in the chaos. "You're safe. I've got you." He didn't force the child into an embrace. Instead, He placed his large, warm hand firmly on the floorboards right in front of her, creating a solid point of focus. Can you copy me? We're going to count the lights together. Just slow, easy breaths. Sophia turned her tear-streaked face toward Hunter. Looking into his calm, fiercely protective eyes, she felt an instinctive, immediate sense of security. Her frantic gasping began to slow. She reached out with a trembling hand and gripped Hunter's calloused thumb, anchoring herself to his strength. Catherine watched in absolute stunned silence as this invisible janitor effortlessly achieved what all her executive authority could not. Within 2 minutes, Sophia's breathing returned to a regular rhythm, her head resting exhausted against Hunter's gray uniform shirt. Hunter gently wiped a tear from the little girl's cheek, offering her a reassuring smile that carried the practiced ease of a dedicated father. You did great. The loud noises are all gone now. As he moved to stand up, his maintenance lanyard swung forward and a small metallic object slipped out from his chest pocket, catching the sharp office lights. It wasn't a standard building keycard. It was a highly specialized military-grade encrypted hardware token, stamped with a unique engineering serial number that Catherine recognized instantly from her days researching advanced systems architecture. It was a level of clearance that shouldn't exist in the hands of a sanitation worker. Before she could speak, Hunter calmly tucked the token back into his shirt, his expression returning to its neutral, unreadable mask. He looked at Catherine, his gaze steady and completely devoid of the deference other employees showed her. She just needed a clear path to breathe, ma'am. The air filters on this floor are running too dry today. I'll adjust the calibration downstairs so it's softer on her lungs. He picked up his cleaning cloth, nodded respectfully, and walked out of the office, pushing his yellow cart past the whispering managers, who quickly parted to let him through. Catherine stayed on the floor for a long moment, holding her sleeping daughter close, her mind racing faster than it ever had during the cyber crisis. She looked down at the floor where Hunter had just been kneeling. Resting near the leg of her desk was a small, discarded sheet of paper from his maintenance cart. She reached out and picked it up. It wasn't a cleaning checklist. Written across the back in precise, elegant handwriting were several complex mathematical equations, mapping the structural load balances of Etherion's secondary network core, the exact parameters that had been modified during the recovery. Her breath hitched. The pieces of the puzzle were violently slamming together, rewriting everything she thought she knew about the hierarchy of her own building. The man scrubbing her floors wasn't just an employee, he was a phantom genius living right under her nose. At that exact moment, her desk phone flashed with an urgent alert from the primary security gate downstairs. A specialized data audit team from an outside firm, personally authorized by Connor Reeves, had just entered the building with an explicit order to seize the 11th floor access terminals. Connor Reeves marched down the 11th floor service corridor, flanked by 3 men in sharp, identical charcoal suits from an outside digital forensics firm. Derek, the arrogant junior engineer, followed closely behind, his face flush with a mix of excitement and malicious anticipation. The glass walls of the surrounding open-plan offices quickly became crowded with employees who stopped typing to press their faces against the partitions. Word had spread instantly through the internal chat servers that the executive suite was descending on the maintenance department. Hunter Blake was near the end of the hallway, methodically replacing a faulty light fixture on a low-voltage panel. He didn't look up when the heavy footsteps approached, though his sharp ears had already calculated the weight, speed, and trajectory of the incoming group. Step away from the terminal, Blake. Connor commanded, his voice projecting clearly across the open floor, intentionally drawing the attention of every nearby staff member. Hunter calmly lowered his tools, turning around with an unhurried grace. He kept his hands loose at his sides, his face a completely unreadable mask of absolute composure. Is there a problem with the infrastructure, Mr. Reeves? Don't play dumb with me, Connor sneered, stepping directly into Hunter's personal space, attempting to use his height and expensive tailoring to intimidate the quiet maintenance worker. We've been running an independent forensic audit of the network logs from the night of the cyber attack. Your employee badge was registered at the 11th floor server node at the exact minute the primary architecture was bypassed. A low-level cleaner has absolutely no business standing near root-level hardware after midnight. Derek stepped forward, eager to please his superior. I caught him hovering right around here myself that night. He's always lurking around the server wings, pretending to mop. It's obvious what he's doing. He's looking for physical access points to sell proprietary data to our competitors. A murmur of shocked whispers rippled through the gathering crowd of office staff. The public judgment was swift and heavy. To the corporate professionals watching from their desks, the narrative made perfect sense. A disgruntled, underpaid janitor using his late-night invisibility to sabotage a $40 billion empire. "Empty your pockets," Connor demanded loudly, pointing a finger at Hunter's gray uniform shirt. "Right now, before I have building security throw you in the back of a police cruiser." Hunter didn't flinch under the weight of the public humiliation. His quiet masculinity remained an unbreakable shield against Connor's performative anger. He reached slowly into his pocket, his fingers passing over the small toy unicorn he kept for Hannah, and instead pulled out the military-grade encrypted hardware token Catherine had spotted earlier. He placed it firmly on the top of his yellow maintenance cart. The lead outside auditor gasped, his eyes widening as he instantly recognized the black, titanium-clad device. Where did a janitor get a Tier 1 encryption bypass key? This is restricted government-level hardware. "He stole it," Connor declared, turning toward the crowd, ensuring everyone heard the accusation. "He's an uneducated thief who found a way to compromise our system from the gutters." This asset is under corporate seizure. Before Connor could reach for the token, the lead auditor stepped toward the primary 11th floor terminal wall, pulling a specialized network override device from his leather briefcase. "We need to lock down this entire node immediately to isolate whatever backdoors he planted." "Wait," Hunter said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a sudden, heavy authority that caused the auditor's hand to freeze midair. It was the tone of a captain speaking to a green recruit. "Don't patch that bypass module into the secondary bus. The current load balance on the western sector is running a compressed routing algorithm. If you force an external override without cycling the primary logic gates first, you'll trigger a systemic thermal loop." Derek let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Listen to him. The janitor is trying to give engineering advice to certified network specialists. Plug it in. Let's lock this thief out for good." The auditor, fueled by Connor's nod of approval, ignored the warning and slammed the override module directly into the server node's main diagnostic port. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then, a sharp, metallic pop echoed from behind the wall panel. Suddenly, every overhead fluorescent light on the 11th floor snapped off, plunging the corridor into darkness before the violent amber emergency strobes flared to life. A high-pitched, deafening warning siren began to wail through the ventilation shafts. Across the open floor, hundreds of desktop monitors flickered into a bright, warning red. "What did you do?" Connor shouted, his composure shattering instantly as his voice pitched with sudden panic. "Fix it. Turn it back on." "The override caused a critical system conflict," the lead auditor screamed over the blaring siren, his hands shaking violently as he typed furiously into a backup tablet. "The Western logistics grid just decoupled from the core network. 60,000 trucks just lost their connection again, and the main server racks are beginning to overheat from a logic loop. We're completely locked out of the primary directory." Panic swept through the 11th floor like wildfire. Employees began frantically shouting, running toward the emergency exits as the system monitors showed the $40 billion network collapsing into an even deeper catastrophic failure than before. Connor stood frozen in the center of the flashing amber light, his face pale, entirely out of his depth, as his manufactured authority dissolved into helpless terror. Money and status could do nothing to stop the digital avalanche he had just triggered. The elevator doors at the end of the hall slid open with a heavy mechanical hiss. Catherine Whitmore stepped out into the chaos, her eyes sweeping over the panicking engineers and the screaming alarms. Her gaze locked onto the center of the corridor. There, standing perfectly still amidst the screaming alarms and rushing crowds, was Hunter Blake. He didn't look afraid. He didn't look humiliated. As the entire digital empire crumbled around them for the second time, the invisible janitor casually reached down, picked up his encryption token, and looked directly at Catherine with an unshakable, steady calm that made the entire room feel instantly silent. The air inside the 11th floor service corridor grew rapidly heavy and warm as the ventilation system choked on the spreading logic loop. The deafening howl of the emergency sirens beat against the glass walls, creating a physical vibration that rattled the executive desk layout. Connor Reeves was sweating through his bespoke shirt, his refined posture entirely gone as he gripped the shoulder of the lead forensic auditor. "Override the lock," Connor shouted, his voice cracking under the mounting pressure. "I don't care about the Western Gateway. Force the connection back online before the morning board brief." "I can't," the auditor yelled back, his fingers trembling violently over his tablet screen. "The system has completely rejected our administrative certificates. It thinks we're an active threat. The internal temperature in the primary server array is spiking past 90 degrees. In less than 8 minutes, the core hard drives will undergo an automatic thermal wipe to protect the data infrastructure. If those drives melt, Ethereum Dynamics doesn't have a routing system anymore. The entire company will go dark permanently. A heavy, suffocating panic swept through the crowd of onlookers. Senior managers stared at one another in absolute horror, realizing the $40 billion empire was sliding toward complete annihilation. Derek, the junior engineer, took a slow step backward into the crowd, his arrogant bravado evaporating as he realized the catastrophic blame would inevitably land on everyone who touched the terminal. Catherine Whitmore pushed through the circle of freezing executives, her breathing shallow but her eyes burning with a desperate, sharp focus. She ignored Connor entirely, her gaze locked onto the tall man in the gray maintenance uniform who stood completely detached from the chaos. While the brightest minds money could buy were drowning in panic, Hunter Blake remained an island of absolute stillness. Catherine walked directly to him, stopping just inches away from his yellow cleaning cart. The contrast between them was stark. The powerful, elite chief executive completely stripped of her institutional certainty, and the invisible janitor possessing an unshakable, quiet masculinity that filled the space between them with a sudden, heavy gravity. "Hunter," Catherine said, her voice dropping below the roar of the alarms, raw with a rare, genuine vulnerability. "The system is melting down from the inside out. They're saying we have less than 8 minutes before everything we've ever built is completely wiped out. Can you stop it?" "Catherine, have you completely lost your mind?" Connor interjects, stepping forward aggressively, his face twisted in a mixture of fear and rage. "He is a sanitation worker. He is the saboteur who caused this entire failure. Security is on their way down to arrest him, and you are asking him to touch our proprietary network? Stand away from him." Catherine didn't look back at her chief operating officer. She kept her eyes fixed on Hunter, her hands tightly clenched at her sides. "I know who authored the foundational code, Hunter. I looked at the original engineering commit logs from 9 years ago. I know your name was wiped from the legal documentation, and I know exactly what you gave up to protect your daughter. I am not asking the janitor to save this company. I am asking the man who built the cathedral." The surrounding executives went completely silent, the weight of her words dropping into the room like a physical shockwave. Derek's mouth hung open, his eyes darting between the CEO and the man he had spent 18 months treating like garbage. Hunter looked at Catherine for a long, silent moment. In her eyes, he didn't see the cold, ruthless corporate executive who had passed him 11 times without a glance. He saw a mother who had held her trembling child on the floor just an hour ago, a human being desperately trying to protect the people depending on her. He reached into his chest pocket, pulled out the titanium-clad encryption token, and stepped past her toward the glowing terminal wall. "Get out of his way," Catherine commanded, her voice cutting through the room like a steel blade as the forensic auditors hesitated. The auditors scrambled backward, clearing a path. Hunter didn't sit down at the desk. He stood before the primary diagnostic terminal, his large, calloused hands resting lightly on the edge of the console. He didn't type with the frantic, chaotic speed of a panicked technician. His fingers moved across the mechanical keyboard with a fluid, rhythmic grace, executing commands in a sequence that looked entirely alien to the standard security engineers. Instead of complex technical jargon flashing on the monitors, the violent red screens began to shift into a deep, steady amber. The screaming cooling fans deep within the walls began to alter their pitch, slowing their frantic rotation as Hunter manually recalibrated the liquid cooling distribution across the sub-basement nodes. "He's bypassing the root administrative layer entirely," the lead auditor whispered in absolute disbelief, his eyes glued to the cascading lines of code. "He's not using a standard protocol. He's talking directly to the core kernel. Only the original architect would know those access vectors exist." As Hunter's hands steadily stabilized the thermal load, a hidden secondary partition within the network architecture suddenly forced itself to the surface of the main display. It wasn't a standard system log. It was an encrypted, mirrored transaction file dating back 9 years, displaying a series of illicit intellectual property transfers signed with a corporate authorization key. Hunter's fingers paused on the keyboard for a fraction of a second. The screen flashed a high-level security prompt, demanding a final author validation code to stop a permanent data purge that was quietly running in the background, a secondary trap that had been laid deep within the architecture long before tonight. The prompt on the screen read, "Enter architect's signature to halt purge." Connor Reeves took a sudden, sharp step toward the terminal, his face turning an ash-gray color under the amber emergency lights as he stared at the specific account numbers detailing the ancient theft displayed on the screen. He realized that the quiet man in the gray uniform wasn't just saving the network, he was unlocking the vault that contained every dark secret the company had been built upon. The prompt on the primary terminal pulsed in a cold, demanding amber light, its reflection fracturing across Connor Reeves's sweating face. Enter. Architect's signature to halt purge. Hunter Blake did not hesitate. His large, scarred fingers hovered over the mechanical keyboard for a single beat before they struck the keys with absolute precision. He did not type a standard password. He entered a complex 24-character algorithmic string, a digital signature composed of the exact mathematical frequencies he had mapped out in a small Seattle coffee shop 9 years ago, long before Ethereum Dynamics became a $40 billion empire. The moment his fingers struck the final key, the frantic blinking of the terminal stopped completely. A heavy, absolute silence fell over the 11th floor service corridor as the deafening howl of the emergency sirens cut out instantly. The violent amber strobe snapped off, replaced a second later by the crisp, steady white illumination of the building's standard power grid. Across the open floor, hundreds of red-tinted monitors flashed simultaneously, clearing their warning screens to display a massive, enterprise-wide notification. Critical meltdown cooldown achieved. System restored. Directly below the restoration confirmation, a line of text materialized in the center of the primary display wall, broadcasting across every floor of the corporate tower. Architect session terminated by Origin founder. Blake, Hunter. The lead forensic auditor stepped backward, his leather briefcase slipping from his hand and hitting the floor with a loud thud. He stared at Hunter, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound shock and academic reverence. The Blake paradigm, the auditor whispered, his voice shaking so loudly it carried across the silent hallway. The core foundation of our entire national logistics network, the textbook architecture taught at MIT. You didn't steal it. You wrote it. Derek, the junior engineer, looked as if the ground had vanished beneath his feet. His face drained of all color, his eyes darting frantically from the heavy yellow maintenance cart to the tall man standing calmly in front of the multi-million-dollar console. The man he had ordered to mop faster, the man he had ridiculed as an uneducated janitor, was the legendary phantom architect whose original code dictated every single line of engineering he had ever studied. This is an illegal intrusion. Connor screamed, his polished composure shattering completely as he attempted to push past Catherine to reach the console. His voice pitched into a desperate, panicked register, his hands clawing at the air. He hacked the system. He bypassed our security layers to manipulate the data. I want this man restrained immediately. Security. Remove this janitor from my building. Be quiet, Connor, Catherine Whitmore said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the absolute freezing weight of a chief executive who had just reclaimed full command of her empire. She stepped forward, her eyes scanning the secondary partition that Hunter's signature had forcibly dragged into the light. The display walls were no longer showing logistics charts. They were streaming the hidden, air-gapped ledger files from 9 years ago, side by side with a modern tracking log. The data was clear, unambiguous, and devastating. It detailed a massive, systematic extraction of Ethereum's proprietary machine learning algorithms, routed through a secondary administrative vendor account. The architecture doesn't lie, Connor, Catherine said, her eyes turning toward her chief operating officer with a cold, piercing intensity. 9 years ago, you and Grant Marshall altered the equity logs while Hunter was away on family leave, burying his name to steal his life's work. And for the past 14 months, you've been using that same stolen access to quietly drain our proprietary routing packages to a holding company in Nevada, preparing to sell us out to a competitor. A collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of employees gathered in the corridor. The narrative Connor had carefully constructed over a decade, the image of the brilliant, irreplaceable executive, dissolved into nothingness in front of the very staff he had managed with an iron fist. Connor took a trembling step back, his eyes darting toward the elevators as he realized every terminal in the building was now capturing his financial crimes in real time. You have no proof of this, he stammered, his fingers twitching against his tailored jacket. These are fabricated maintenance logs. No board of directors will believe a janitor over me. They won't have to believe him, Catherine replied calmly, reaching into her pocket and pulling out a secure, Encrypted drive containing the unedited cold backup logs she had personally pulled from the sub-basement server room. They will believe the system records you forgot to clean from the air-gapped network, the same records that the FBI's cybercrime division has been reviewing since 8 o'clock this morning. The heavy mechanical hiss of the service elevator echoed down the long hall. The doors slid open, but it wasn't the building guards Connor had been waiting for. Two federal agents in dark suits stepped out onto the 11th floor, flanked by the elderly, gray-haired chairman of the board of directors. The crowd parted instantly, the silence in the room thickening until the only sound remaining was the steady, rhythmic clicking of the chairman's shoes against the polished concrete floor. He didn't look at Connor. He didn't look at Catherine. He walked directly past the executive suite, stopping right in front of the yellow maintenance cart where Hunter Blake stood, quietly waiting with his hands loose at his sides. The two federal agents stepped past the board chairman, their movements synchronized and efficient. They stopped directly in front of Connor Reeves. Before the former chief operating officer could utterance a single word of protest, the lead agent gripped Connor's wrists, bringing his hands behind his back as the metallic click of handcuffs echoed sharply through the silent corridor. Connor's face contorted into an expression of raw, unadulterated humiliation. He looked down at his wrists, then up at the hundreds of employees who were actively watching his definitive downfall. The elegant, untouchable executive who had spent a decade manipulating the destinies of everyone in the building was escorted toward the service elevator like a common criminal. He passed Derek, who pointedly looked at the floor, completely abandoning his former mentor to save whatever remained of his own career. Julian Croft, the elderly chairman of the board, watched the elevator doors close before he turned his attention back to Hunter Blake. The billionaire chairman took a slow, deep breath, his aristocratic posture bending slightly as he bowed his head in a gesture of profound public apology. 9 years ago, this board accepted a falsified ledger, Julian said, his voice projecting clearly across the crowded floor so that every single staff member could hear his words. We allowed a predatory theft to occur under our oversight, and we reaped billions of dollars in profit from an architecture that belonged entirely to you, Mr. Blake. There are no words sufficient to repair the injustice you have endured, but today the historical record is officially corrected. Julian signaled to his assistant, who stepped forward with a leather-bound corporate charter. By an absolute, unanimous vote of the board of directors, we are offering you full restoration of your founding equity, retroactive to the day of incorporation. At our current valuation, that translates to an immediate 9-digit settlement. Furthermore, we are formally requesting that you accept the position of Chief Technology Officer of Etherion Dynamics, effective immediately. A low, reverent murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. The employees stared at Hunter, waiting for the explosive reaction, the triumphant shout, or the angry validation that any ordinary man would display after such a massive public reversal. But Hunter didn't look at the corporate charter. He didn't look at the billionaire chairman. His quiet masculinity remained entirely undisturbed by the mention of hundreds of millions of dollars. He looked down at his large, calloused hands, then turned his head to look at the yellow maintenance cart that had been his companion for the past 18 months. I appreciate the board's gesture, Mr. Croft, Hunter said, his deep voice remarkably steady and calm. But I didn't write those 47 lines of code last night to claim a title or a corner office. I did it because a crumbling system puts drivers in danger on the highway, and because a little girl on the 32nd floor couldn't find a clear breath of air. He looked directly into Julian's eyes, his gaze carrying a grounded weight that made the billionaire chairman look suddenly small. I need 3 days to consider your proposal. My daughter is expecting me at 5 o'clock, and her schedule doesn't adapt to corporate timelines. Julian Croft blinked in surprise, entirely unaccustomed to having a multi-million-dollar offer treated with such patient detachment. He nodded slowly, respect softening his weathered face. Take whatever time you require, Mr. Blake. The position will be waiting for you. As the board members and the remaining executives began to clear the hallway, discussing the massive legal restructuring ahead, the suffocating crowd finally thinned out. The heavy tension that had gripped the 11th floor for hours began to dissolve, leaving behind a quiet, hollow stillness. Catherine Whitmore didn't leave with the board. She stood near the diagnostic terminal, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to hide the subtle trembling that still lingered in her fingers. The ruthless, highly controlled CEO who was feared by every logistics supplier in the country looked completely vulnerable. For the past 6 months, she had possessed everything money and authority could buy: power, status, a $40 billion empire, yet she had possessed absolutely no peace. She watched Hunter as he quietly began to organize his cleaning cloths, returning them to the yellow cart with the same methodical care he had shown when rewriting the network kernel. "You're entirely original, aren't you?" Catherine said softly, stepping closer to him. The distance between them was no longer dictated by corporate hierarchy, but by a growing, deep emotional gravity. Hunter paused, looking up at her. The sharp office lights caught the steady, warm depth of his eyes. "I'm just a father, Catherine. Everything else is just numbers on a screen." Catherine let out a slow, quiet breath, her eyes searching his face. In the silence that stretched between them, the emotional chemistry grew naturally, rooted not in forced romance, but in a profound recognition of safety. She realized that while she had been running herself into the ground trying to control a crumbling empire, this man had been providing absolute security to everyone around him without even trying. "I spent 3 months hunting across the country for a ghost," Catherine whispered, a rare, genuine smile touching her lips as she looked at his gray uniform. "And you were right here, making sure the world didn't break underneath our feet." "The things that keep the world standing are usually the things people forget to look at," Hunter replied, his voice softening completely as he looked back at her. For the first time in the long corridor, he didn't step back into the shadows. He stood firmly in the light, the silence between them holding a promise of a future neither of them had expected to find in the dark of a national crisis. 3 days later, the morning sun poured through the high-arched windows of the private executive boardroom on the 32nd floor. Hunter Blake sat across from Julian Croft and Catherine Whitmore, dressed simply in a dark flannel shirt, worn jeans, and clean work boots. He looked entirely at ease, completely unaffected by the absolute luxury of the room or the multi-million-dollar corporate charter resting on the table between them. Julian Croft leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "The legal teams have completed the audit, Mr. Blake. The retroactive equity and the settlement figures have been finalized. It is a sum that guarantees your family's influence for generations. We are ready to announce your appointment as Chief Technology Officer to the Wall Street Press this afternoon." Hunter looked at the documents, then up at Julian, his expression carrying that familiar, unshakable calm. "I won't be taking the CTO position, Mr. Croft. And I don't want a press conference." Julian blinked, utterly stunned. "You are turning down the leadership of the very architecture you built? The public recognition you are rightfully owed?" "I chose my daughter 9 years ago, and I choose her today," Hunter said, his deep voice resonant and steady. "The public profile that comes with that office creates a world of noise. I don't need a title to know what I am capable of, and Hannah doesn't need a famous father. She just needs me." He slid a modified addendum across the polished mahogany table toward Catherine. "I will accept a quiet, structural settlement that ensures Hannah's future, but under one condition. 40% of those funds are to be directed immediately and anonymously into an educational technology endowment for the underserved school districts on the northwest side of Chicago. No press releases. No corporate branding. Just buy the kids the tools they need." Catherine watched him, her eyes shining with a profound, quiet admiration. She saw that his quiet masculinity was not a defensive wall, but a deep well of genuine humility and strength. "It will be done exactly as you wish, Hunter," she whispered, her voice carrying an emotional warmth that left the boardroom feeling remarkably human for the first time in its history. Over the next 6 months, the shifting culture inside Etherion Dynamics became a case study in corporate redemption. Catherine systematically dismantled the predatory internal hierarchy that Connor Reeves had left behind. She instituted a sweeping operational policy, formally recorded in the corporate bylaws as the Blake Standard. The new mandate required every line of engineering, every routing optimization, and every single employee contribution to be logged, credited, and directly compensated at the point of creation, completely regardless of a worker's department, background, or lack of a corporate degree. Derek, the junior engineer, found his responsibilities drastically shifted. He was reassigned away from the high-profile development teams and placed on an introductory rotation, learning to maintain the baseline hardware infrastructure alongside the entry-level staff. It was a harsh, necessary lesson in humility, forcing him to look at the very people he had previously dismissed as invisible. As autumn faded into a crisp, clear Chicago winter, the frantic pacing of the corporate empire began to slow into a rhythm of genuine stability. One Thursday evening, well past 8 o'clock, the main lights of the 32nd floor dimming into a soft, restful amber glow. The vast expanse of the open-plan offices had emptied out, leaving the glass tower entirely quiet. Catherine walked out of her executive suite, carrying her coat over her arm. As she turned the corner toward the East Corridor elevators, she stopped. A tall man in a clean gray uniform shirt was methodically organizing a facility cart near the primary diagnostic terminal. He wasn't doing it because a time card demanded it, or because a supervisor was watching. He moved with the same fluid, rhythmic care he had used to save the network, polishing the edge of a console with a quiet focus. Catherine stepped closer, a soft, genuine smile breaking across her face. You know, the board officially cleared your accounts months ago, Hunter. You own a significant piece of this entire $40 billion empire. You really don't have to do this anymore. Hunter stopped his movements, turning to look at her. The sharp reflection of the city skyline fractured across the glass partition behind him, but his deep eyes remained entirely grounded. Maybe, he said, the smallest, warmest version of a smile appearing on his lips. But I like taking care of things people forget to look at. Before Catherine could reply, the heavy mechanical chime of the lobby elevator echoed down the hall. The doors slid open, and a small, vibrant figure came running down the corridor. Hannah Blake, now carrying a brightly colored backpack from her late afternoon art program, sprinted toward her father. But as she reached the center of the hallway, she slowed her steps. She looked at Catherine, her dark eyes clear and remarkably perceptive. Without an ounce of hesitation or standard childhood shyness, Hannah walked right up to the powerful chief executive and gently took Catherine's hand, her small fingers wrapping securely around Catherine's palm. It was the universal gesture of a child who had decided an adult was completely safe. Hunter watched his daughter hold the hand of the woman who had once walked past him as if he were part of the concrete architecture. He didn't look away, and he didn't step back into the shadows. For the first time in a hallway he had mopped 100 times, he stood firmly in the center of the frame, the quiet, emotional chemistry between him and Catherine locking into place like a perfect, unyielding foundation. In a world that spent its days sprinting toward wealth, corporate stages, and loud, elevated names, a world where people built their entire identities out of the desperate need to be seen, the man who had held the entire structure together was content to stand in the quiet evening light of the building he had created, watching his daughter build a hopeful, peaceful future. Some people spend their lives standing proudly on the stage, receiving the applause of a crowd that will forget them by morning. And some people are the quiet, unbreakable reason the stage stands up at all. They are the ones who repair what breaks in the dark of the night, who clean the floors, other people carelessly dirty, and who write the codes that save the empires that forgot their names. They are the anchors the world cannot function without, whether the world ever truly knows their names or not.